Chapter 11, Terrorism and Homeland Security. Learning objectives. Explain what most definitions of terrorism include and what three elements in common in terrorism. Summarize how the FBI defines and classifies terrorism groups in the United States, including examples of groups within each category. Describe what motivates most terrorists. List and rank the terrorists and threats most likely to be used and the relative level of impact that each represents. Identify federal office that was established as a result of 9/11 and its five core mission area, what the five core missions are. Discuss the basic responsibilities of local police officers with regard to Homeland Security. Explain the two concerns discussed regarding the current war on terrorism. So, introduction. The war on drugs has taken a backseat to the war on terrorism as a result of 9/11. The events of 9/11 added a new dimension to policing in the United States. Completed and attempted terrorist attacks represent a significant, difficult challenge for law enforcement, requiring new levels of cooperation and communication between law enforcement agencies and their officers. So when you look at this, 9/11 did change things. The focus was more or less drug-related missions type deal before 9/11. 9/11 got us to concentrate more on terrorism, and it started with international terrorism from abroad, and eventually it became to include domestic terrorism. So it definitely changed the way, not only how we do law enforcement in this country and what things that we put emphasis on, but it changed the way Americans think and how we live. What is terrorism? So it includes the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof, in furtherance of political or social objectives. Criminal in nature. Targets are typically symbolic. Terrorist actions are always aggressive and often violent. Asymmetric slant. So when we look at the terrorism, it's always something that, first of all, the American philosophy, the U.S. government is we don't negotiate with terrorists. One of the reasons you can't negotiate with terrorists because they're not rational. And I'll give you an example. If there's 10 points that you and the terrorists don't agree on, if you could actually sit down and negotiate with and agree on 7 of them, the U.S. would view that as, well, we have a win because we've got 7 of 10 things we agree on. Terrorists would view it as a failure because you didn't agree to all 10 things that they wanted. So that's why you can't negotiate with terrorists. And not to mention, they don't hold their word. It's always criminal in nature, and their targets mean something. They're usually typically symbolic. It's something about that target or targets that they chose to attack. It's always usually aggressive and very violent. And that's because they want to send a message. Part of terrorism is scaring people. That's one of the reasons you want it to be very violent. Classification of terrorist acts. So I mentioned earlier, international and domestic. So first we're going to look at international because this is the first thing that came on the front for us with 9/11. First threat, foreign state sponsors. Second threat, formalized terrorist groups. Third threat, loosely affiliated international radical extremists that travel freely to the U.S. So you see there's 3 stages of this. When it's sponsored by foreign states, when it's formalized terrorist groups, and you think about loosely international radical extremists. Now, the problem you've had with that one right there is some of them live here now. They stay here enough, or they come and go enough that presents all kinds of problems. So one of the things that we have to be aware of is the 3 types of terror, international terrorism. Now, this is something that's been on the increase here recently in this country, and it's primarily driven by politics and political ideologies. White supremacists, black supremacists, militia groups, right-wing extremists, left-wing extremists, pro-life extremists, animal rights extremists, and environmental extremists. So when you see all these different groups, they all have these extreme views. Now, I'll be honest with you, in many cases, as a result of my career in federal law enforcement, I would come in contact with some of the people from some of these various types of groups. And they do strike you initially as being normal and have a normal conversation and kind of appear to be normal in how they think and how they do things. If you talk to them enough, then you'll find out, wait a minute, there's something different about this lady. There's something different about this guy. And then you'll start hearing their views. One of the things that they're pretty good about is not espousing their extremist views to people they don't know. So a lot of times if they feel like they'll try to test you and try to put something out there to see how you feel about it before they go into this. And other times they may let the guard down and say too much, and then you can realize kind of who they are. Motivations for terrorists produce widespread fear. Remember I said the reason it's so violent and aggressive, it's about creating fear. It's to scare people, not only scare people, but scare governments. Obtain worldwide, national, and local recognition for its cause. Harass, weaken, or embarrass government security forces so that the government overreacts and appears repressive. Steal or extort money and equipment. Destroy facilities and disrupt lines of communication to create a doubt that the government can provide and protect. So it's really about scaring folks, scaring the governments. And even though some people may look at this as they are bad or they're evil, they're not stupid. They know what they're doing has a purpose. For instance, do something and make a government react and then claim that the government is being heavy-handed and trying to repress, and use propaganda and social media and things to get it out there. Look what the government's doing for us. But what they don't tell you is what they did to get the government to do that. Destroying facilities and things along those lines. Again, that's symbolic a lot of times. So when we look at they want to some of the other things they want to do too is they like capitalism. They despise capitalism. So one of the things you want to do is discourage foreign investments in tourism and assistance programs that can affect the country's target economy and support of the government in power. So these are the things that if they're trying to overthrow a government or destabilize a government, these are some of the things they don't want to happen. They don't want tourism. They don't want investments. They want the people to struggle so they can say it's the government that's doing it to you, not because of things that we're doing. Influence government decisions and legislation, other critical decisions. One of the things too now is they try to get people who think like them to get into government. And whenever they have to help them out who think the way they do, whenever people are prisoners, they always request freeing prisoners because a lot of times some of their colleagues are actually apprehended, not only in a country where their home country is, but possibly in other countries. So they may do something in one country, trying to put pressure on another country to release prisoners. Satisfy vengeance. It always seems like there's a vengeance satisfied. And so when you hear some of these things, they're very extreme. It may go back to almost biblical times what their grievance is. Turn the tide in the guerrilla war by forcing government security forces to concentrate their efforts in urban areas. They want to fight in areas where people live. Guerrilla warfare. They don't want to fight out in open fields and forests and stuff. They want to be in cities and stuff because when damage starts getting inflicted, it starts getting inflicted on not only them, but people who live there. Methods used by terrorists. They love arson, explosives, and bombs. This is something that goes way back. And when you start looking at modern day terrorism, these are some of the things that you commonly see. Weapons of mass destruction, when you're talking about things such as nuclear and chemical and biological. Technological terrorism is when you start attacking things like power plants and structures and stuff that provides a purpose of service to people. Kidnapping and hostage taking. A lot of times that will accompany also demands for ransom as well. But when they're kidnapping and hostage taking, they're not just snatching normal people off the streets usually. Now they do that too. But if they can get high profile people or people who they think have money or means, that's even better. And active shooters. You find with these folks, they have active shooters. They will go into places and just, when we first started hearing about active shooters, it was in foreign countries when I was growing up. And what they do is they would just go into places and start shooting up the place. We now see that happening in this country, i.e. at schools. So, Executive Order 13228 established the Department of Homeland Security. This happened after 9/11. President George W. Bush, when he implemented that and the executive order, and they established a whole nother department, and it was because of terrorism. And they have 5 core missions: prevent terrorism, enhance security, secure and manage all our borders, enhance and administer our immigration laws, safeguard and secure cyberspace, strengthen national preparedness and resilience. So of this Department of Homeland Security might be the largest department that we have now, because if you see these 5 core missions, that is very extensive. And that includes a whole lot when you look at that, when you read into that, how much that entails and what all they're responsible for. So we have the National Incident Management System. So this is a system that was put into place because of now, one of the things that we understand before 9/11, America had a particularly when it came to law enforcement, there was a serious issue with law enforcement where they didn't work together, federal, state, and local. You didn't even have most local law enforcement agencies didn't even work together, and they didn't share information. And this was a problem. And 9/11 showed that we have serious issues we had to address, because when you don't have your agencies, law enforcement agencies communicating, then this makes it very easy for people who have ill means or things that they want to do to your country a lot easier. So this basically was a way of putting things together where in the event of national situations or incidents and stuff, law enforcement agencies had a way to communicate, whether they were federal, state, or local, to coordinate investigative activity so that we could actually keep America safe, apprehend who's doing it, or stop something before it happens. But this is what we're putting together, the National Incident Management System. This is about law enforcement. This is about getting these people able to work together in these various agencies at all levels. Here's what it's not. It's not a response plan. It only used during large-scale incidents. A communication plan is not. Only applicable to certain emergency management and incident responses. So we're talking about things of usually a national magnitude, something large scale. Only the incident command system and organizational chart. So in a static system. So when you look at this, this is what it's not. It's not something to be used every day. It is specifically for large scale incidents when, like 9/11. Something like that happens. Now you got all these various agencies, law enforcement agencies involved, and they need to be able to work together. 2 key principles is flexibility. So what they look at is, even though these law enforcement agencies may be working together, this does not tell them exactly how they need to do things. So you have flexibility from the various agencies about how to do stuff. Standardization, a lot of times is for some of the things that they do need to standardize, like, for instance, the communication process. Those are the kind of things you want to have some standardization with. It's like, okay, how do we communicate with each other? You got to have some standardization, even though you still have to have flexibility. Standardization about how to get things, flexibility about how to execute on a lot of that. 5 core components: preparedness, communications and information management, resource management, command and management, ongoing management, and maintenance. So when you look at the 5 core right there, again, this is the kind of stuff, if any of you have ever been in law enforcement or in military and operations and war zones and things like that, these are the kind of things that pops up, and they're critical to mission, they're mission essential. So we have the National Emergency Communication Plan. So this is something that in the event of national situation, something like 9/11 or a major national incident, where government and people can communicate. And now this is not law enforcement specific. Now, this is something that's coordination, basically. How do people communicate in a time of a sense of emergency? You may have some agencies like the Red Cross or like that may need to be involved in some type of communication process in the event something goes, the fire department, emergency management systems, all this, how can they communicate? So you have the National Emergency Communication Plan, which is something that was put into place, I think around 2004, for this purpose to how do people communicate in the event of a national, the people that need to communicate between the governments, law enforcement, the military, service organizations, the Red Cross, fire departments, how can they communicate? That's what these things came to be. And you can see the 5 steps right there that everybody at some point in time you need to go through and understand so that you can actually be an effective member and communicate appropriately with others as need to in the event of a national emergency. So local law enforcement, homeland security. First thing and foremost you have to understand is local law enforcement does not have laws for when it comes to dealing with international type stuff or even things like terrorism. That's your federal government. So local law enforcement, Homeland Security has to have ways to work together, because it's critical. A lot of times local law enforcement may be the first to find out about something or experience something or see something. So now you got to look at this partnership, knowing the enemy and being vigilant and prevention, completing the suspicious activity reports and sharing information, preparing the agency and the community, practicing the response, assessing risk and identifying potential terrorist targets, being proactive, and forming partnerships. So that's exactly what we're talking about, partnerships. But most importantly, you have to train. So Homeland Security has to do a lot of training with state and local law enforcement so that they can be prepared and kind of know what they're looking for. Because a lot of times when you see completing suspicious activity reports and sharing information, a lot of times that will come from local law enforcement, because they're the ones on the streets. They're the ones out there seeing and hearing stuff. So they have to know how to complete these and get this information shared with the federal government. But being proactive and having these partnerships, you do that in a time, and you practice and you work on this stuff in a time when you have peace and you don't have discard, don't have a lot of things going on. You don't wait to a crisis situation or a terrorist attack to try to figure out how to do this stuff. You do it. They practice on this year round for that reason. Concerns related to the war on terror. Civil rights. You know, when you look at people in this country, people have civil rights. You know, when we are looking at, for instance, if someone suspects you of a terrorist, you know, what happens to you? Are your rights immediately thrown out the window, you know, for the safety of the company, for the country? Or do your civil rights still stay in place? Because you suspected of something doesn't mean you actually did it. It could have been someone else, and on the surface, it appeared to be you. So everybody's civil rights have to be preserved, even in the time of war. Now, there are things as a result of retaliation or discrimination against people of Middle Eastern descent. You have some people that many folks may view as they may be predisposed by virtue of where they come from, the Middle East. They're Arabic or they're Muslim. So you have to be really careful about retaliation of those types of things. And a lot of times you have to look at the folks at home to ensure and let people know it's like, just because someone's different from you and they come from a different place does not mean they're associated with terrorism. So, and if you labeling everybody as suspicious, there's a high probability when somebody really does come through, it'll be just, you won't catch it because you've already labeled everybody else. They'll just follow there with everybody else. That concludes this chapter.